This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. On this episode of the Speaking of Writers podcast, the book is Burning Down the House, Talking Heads, and the New York scene that transformed rock. The author is Jonathan Gould. Few bands have burned brighter and stranger than Talking Heads, from CBGB to MTV, from art school roots to avant-garde stardom. The band's story is one of creative friction, wild ambition, and cultural transformation. Today, we're joined by Jonathan Gould, a music historian and contributor to The New Yorker, to discuss this new book. It's a definitive chronicle, not just of a band, but of a moment, downtown New York in the 1970s and 80s, where punk, art, and commerce collided, and Talking Heads thrived. Let's talk about Burn, Bohemia, and the burning of rock's rulebook. Jonathan Gould, welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. Pleasure to have a chance to talk about this.
So, what first drew you to tell the story of Talking Heads?
Well, I had written previous books, one about the Beatles and another about Otis Redding. And one way to sort of approach this or articulate this is that to me, the Beatles were the archetype of a rock band. I talk about that actually a lot in this book about how much they were the archetype of a rock band. Otis, on the other hand, was in many ways the archetype of a soul singer, of a particular type of African American gospel trained singer who came of age in the 1960s. And by the time I was done with those two books, I desperately wanted to get out of the 1960s, is one thing I would say. I lived through that period, but I'd spent a lot of time writing about it. And so I made it all the way to the 1970s, which I was very, very proud of. But the sort of connection between all of this is that to me, in many ways, Talking Heads were the paradigm of a second generation rock group or of what came to be known as an alternative or indie rock group. Um, and at the same time, their whole career as a band, their success as a band, and their whole musical evolution was largely about a gradual engagement with black music, which was the thing from the very beginning that set them apart from the other bands in that downtown New York scene, or particularly the CBGB scene, as far as that goes, and eventually sort of brought them to the point where they expanded into this extraordinary sort of multicultural musical organization that made some extraordinary music along the way.
So, why now? What felt timely or necessary about this book in the current musical or cultural moment?
Well, a lot of things, and I struggle with this myself. I'm about to do a talk upstate with Ben Ratliff, who wrote a book about the ubiquity of music, that all music is available all the time nowadays. And as a result, even writing about a band like Talking Heads, it's necessary really to even explain what an album once was, particularly in the LP era, when there was this record that came out with, 8 or 9 or 10 tracks on it on two sides, with this interruption in the middle that was something quite like a musical set in a club or something like that. But one of the things that the way we live nowadays and the utter availability of music has sort of tended to deprive us of is the notion of an evolution, and the notion of the way that music is tied to our social history, to our cultural history. So I'm not trying to, well, on one level, I am trying to educate people about this, but I'm not trying to teach people a lesson about this. But to me, to talk about this band, which after all broke up 30 odd years ago, more than that, 40 years ago almost, um, in a historical context, in a particular moment in time, is to me an important thing to do. The other thing about them, though, that to me is fascinating and that really was revealed when their great triumph stopped making sense, which is kind of their apotheosis as a band, when the film was released yet again last year in a new format and all of this sort of thing. When I went to see it at the Brooklyn Academy of Music on a giant screen and all of this, the thing that struck me about it is there's almost nothing that's anachronistic in it. If you look at any rock group from the 1960s, let's say, between the hair and the clothes and all of this sort of thing, it's pretty much screaming at you 1960s. You know what historical period you're in. Because of a certain sort of minimalist and kind of modernist sensibility that Talking Heads had, the way they look, the staging of the show, their haircuts, I mean, all of the superficial things, but all of the more interesting things too, they don't look dated. And
Yeah.
there's an interesting way that we sort of can learn that something happened in that period, and let's say the 1980s, that became the baseline in terms of aesthetics for a great deal of what's happened since. And so that's an interesting aspect and a sort of timely aspect about the group to me now. Also, it's been 50 years, and when I first got interested in popular music in the 1960s and began playing popular music in the late 60s and 1970s, the idea that anything 50 years before that was before Louis Armstrong, right? The idea that is to say in the 60s, the idea that music would have this, that popular music would have this kind of longevity to it, that we'd still be listening to it, in the way that we are, is an amazing idea. And that gets, of course, back to the theme of Ben Ratliff's book about this ubiquitous sort of musical world that we live in now.
You brought back memories of when I went to see Stop Making Sense for the first time. I think it was a midnight screening growing up on Long Island. A high school friend of mine was a huge fan and got me into him, and I was hooked. And you're right. That watching that movie, they were not dated at all.
Yeah,
The
it's it's
band.
it's it's striking. The most dated thing in it are the the words projected on the screens in back, which are very 1980s New York art world.
Yeah.
But aside from that, that's about it. People look now the way they looked then, or the way those people looked then. And of course, Burns' extraordinary turn with the big suit. That kind of that too is ageless. I suppose it's possible that someone could have worn a suit like that, and in the Dada sort of cafes in Switzerland in the 1910s. But it's a timeless sort of a timeless costume, let's say.
Yeah, no, it is. What was your research process like, and were there surprises in the archives or interviews that shifted the narrative a little bit?
Yeah, I would say so. When I started writing the book, I was very familiar with the band's music. I had listened to it since they began. I had revered it, I think is the right word
Mhm.
for it, for a lot of reasons. But I didn't know much. I wasn't a fan in the sense of I wasn't identified with one or the other of them. I didn't follow them to sort of think about what their personal relations were like, or what their personalities outside of the music were like. And so for me, the research was in some ways an education on that aspect of them. And the relations between them were pretty difficult. In some ways, almost from the beginning. I mean, one of the first things that you don't think about this until you project yourself into the situation of having to write about people. One of the first things I came to understand was that when they got together, first a little bit in Providence,
Yeah.
where Chris Franz and Tina Weymouth were in the process of graduating from RISD, and David Byrne, who had dropped out of RISD after his freshman year, was basically just hanging around the town because it was a cool place to be. When they first got together there, and then again a few months later in New York City, and moved into a loft with one another on Christie Street and on the Lower East Side, they barely knew one another. They hadn't been close friends in college or something like that. Tina especially barely knew David at all. Chris and David had formed briefly formed a rock group in Providence and played one or two gigs together. But as I say, they didn't really know one another. And I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't been essentially plucked from obscurity after their maybe third or fourth gig at CBGB's by being sort of sort of placed on the front page of the Village Voice as the poster children for this scene that was developing there. I don't know what would have happened in terms of whether they would have stayed together, whether, like most rock bands, they would have sort of drifted apart after, sort of trying to make a living at it and not succeeding and so on and so forth. But they received so much positive critical reinforcement so soon, um, that too kind of sort of threw them together with one another. And then, there's no question about the fact when you play music with people, and I spent a lot of the 1970s playing in rock groups and early 1980s. There is a camaraderie that develops. There is a form of friendship that develops just by virtue of working with one another and taking some satisfaction in what you're doing. But that was, I think, pretty much the extent of the camaraderie or personal affection that existed in the band. And of course, the other dimension of that is that, and this, I guess, was in some ways, I won't say the biggest surprise, but the biggest, the most interesting sort of twist in the story that I became aware of and had to find a way to incorporate into the book was the fact that David Byrne grew up with what we now refer to as Asperger's or high functioning autism in a period when Asperger's or high functioning autism, in a manner of speaking, didn't exist. It hadn't been recognized by the medical establishment, much less ordinary people. It's now become a very familiar concept to many of us. We talk glibly about so and so being on the spectrum and that sort of thing. But and I don't know whether I would have written about this in the way that I did if David had not himself diagnosed himself as having grown up with Asperger's in the early 2000s, actually well after the band broke up. But when one takes that into account, so much of his originality and of the social awkwardness and disquiet that he projected as a performer and also offstage as well. And so much of the such an aspect of the difficult personal dimension relations in the band um, come into a new kind of focus, I guess. But to me, the most interesting thing about his Asperger's, or as I say, high functioning autism, to me was not its effect on his relationships with other people. It was its effect on his creative sensibility. And there too, this has to be put in context. It's not the explanation for David Byrne's originality, um, despite the fact that originality is certainly one of the things that anybody, whether they like him or not, would attribute to his musical sensibility and artistic sensibility in general. It's not the explanation, it's not the Rosetta Stone of who he is, but it is an important element. And I became quite fascinated with the way that it contributed to what he was able to do.
Yeah, he's often seen, of course, as the driving visionary behind this band. Do you see the band as a democracy or something else?
Well, I write about the band in the book as a democracy that was eventually
No.
disrupted by the aristocracy of talent,
Mm.
and that's a kind of that's a kind of picturesque way of putting it. But what I mean is this: um, everybody in the band improved dramatically on their instruments and as musicians in general over the course of the band. Remember, when the band started, Tina had never played bass before. And part of what was certainly a challenge for Tina was the very idea of a female instrumentalist in a rock group in the 1970s was a complete anomaly. I point out in the book that the exceptions one can name um, at that time in the 1970s, which were Linda Eastman and Christine McVie. They were married to people in the group, right?
Yeah.
In the case of Christine McVie, particularly, she was a very gifted musician. But nevertheless, what was she doing there? Well, she was the wife of the bass player in that sense, okay? And in Tina's case, just to add to that, it was one thing for a woman to play an instrument. It was another thing for a woman to play a bass, a rhythm section instrument, which for whatever reason, the history of the bass, of course, is tied to the string bass, which is an enormous instrument, which many women would have trouble just getting around in this sense. But I mean, wrapping themselves around it in that way. But anyway, they all improved dramatically as over the course of the band. Um, but I would also say that over the course of the band, the singularity of David's talent um, emerged, as I say, in a way that disrupted the fundamental sort of artistic democracy of the group. Um, David David has powers of concentration and focus and an ability to simply to take anything that he does as far as he can possibly do it. That's very different temperamentally, I would say, from the other people in that group. And it's interesting. I mean, when Chris and Tina had the opportunity, they formed this spin-off group, which was Tom Tom
Yeah.
Club, which was in many ways expressly sort of, a reaction to the supposed intellectuality and artiness and all of the things that many people regarded as the strengths of Talking Heads. And I think that corresponded a lot with their temperament, which certainly wasn't intellectual, and in a way that's certainly was very different from the intense sort of artistic drive that David had and ambition that David had in that way.
Yeah, I remember interviewing Chris when he wrote a book almost 10 years ago now on this
Mhm.
very program. And you mentioned about Tina not playing bass. I remember him talking about that too.
Oh, sure. I mean, it was, and it must have been very difficult for her.
Yeah.
And Tina, Tina was not and has never been a feminist in the sense of, Tina grew up in, Tina, like Chris, and I learned that this is not a pejorative term, was a military brat, in the sense of, that is to say, the child of a military family. And she was also grew up in a family that was, her mother had a serious Catholic faith, and she was raised in Catholic schools and in the Catholic Church. Anyway, I say all of this because Tina never sort of expressed a kind of feminist point of view in terms of her role in music or anything like that. That said, though, she was subjected to all of the pressures and all of the indignities, I think, that brought feminism to the fore in the 1960s and 70s. So I have a lot of, I won't say sympathy, I have a lot of admiration for the way that she dealt with a lot of that.
Jonathan, I'm sure you've interviewed them in the past. Did you interview them, any of the members of the band, for this book?
No, I set out. Um, I was aware that there had been one other book, serious book, big book that had been written about them. It was done in 2001 by a now deceased. It was written by a now deceased Brooklyn novelist who started out, named David Bowman, who started out writing a so-called authorized biography of the group. That is to say, he had all of their not just permission but cooperation to do the book. And he started out interviewing them and all of this sort of thing. Anyway, this was right before actually they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was in the early 2000s. Relations in the band were very tense, and the whole thing turned into a fiasco. That's not my opinion, that was their opinion. Tina Weymouth wound up telling David Bowman that everything in his book was wrong. Okay,
Mm.
so and David's approach to it, Bowman's approach to it, was pretty impressionistic. He was a novelist. He didn't have any background in music. He didn't have any background in writing about music. It was kind of, I'll just leave it at that, let's just say. So I thought, here we are 25 years later, or 20 years later, rather. I have a background as a professional musician. I'd written two well-received biographies, one of the musical biographies, one of the Beatles and the other of Otis Redding. I was hoping that they would be, if not thrilled, certainly willing to talk with me about their musical careers. And of course, this is especially because the focus of my writing has always been on the musical careers. I don't write fan books. I'm not,
Mm.
this is not a book about how cool David Byrne is or how cute Tina Weymouth is or any of those things. That's not part of my purview. I'm just not that, that's not what I'm focused on here. Anyway, they all had different reasons for declining my offer to speak with me. In David's case, he was in the midst of trying to put American Utopia back onto Broadway after the interruption of COVID. In Chris's case, he was about to come out with his memoir, and as he put it, he wanted to save his stories for that. Tina said that she too was writing a memoir, but I don't know what's become of that. And Jerry was the most affecting, sort of as the new guy, as the eternal new guy in the band. Jerry said that he'd really like to speak with me, but he didn't want to be the only one. And I think he was right about that. If I had had contemporaneous quotes from Jerry Harrison and from none of the other ones, that would have given a strange imbalance to the book. So while I kept renewing this request for them to speak with me as time, year after year, while I was working on it, it never, it never happened. That said, though, from the very beginning, Talking Heads were absolute darlings of the music press. And I was able to put together a virtual archive of material going back to 1975 um, that meant that did not lack for them talking to interviewers, to music writers, to reporters, to anybody who would listen, as far as that goes, about most of what was going on musically and otherwise in the band. So there was a time when biographies of living people that was a rather unusual thing. That's not the case anymore. So I was forced to go back to sort of that way of doing things and relying totally on the public record, so to speak. The great thing being that the public record now is just instantly, is available at the click of a mouse.
Any feedback? This book came out in June. Any feedback from the band
Yeah,
members?
I haven't gotten any. Um, the only thing I don't feel good about is that I shortly before the book came out, I wrote to all four of them, or in some cases to their people, so to speak, that is to say, the people who represent them,
Mm.
and offered them, said that it would be my honor to give them, signed copies of the book. And Jerry accepted through as did his manager. Um, Chris and Tina declined my offer. And I have to think that represents some form of displeasure, or that indicates some form of displeasure on their part. Um, and I'm not being, sort of coy about this. Um, there were many things that Tina Weymouth said as time went on about David Byrne that were extremely harsh, that were extremely critical and were extremely harsh. They are a matter of public record. Tina has occasionally said that she was misquoted about this or misquoted about that. But the way I work is, I go back and I talk to the people who wrote the article and ask them, challenge that concept in that way. It's all pretty true and it's all pretty real. And I think that she's and probably Chris also are not pleased with seeing some of those quotes um, in print yet again, as far as that goes, or in what they suggest about some of the levels of I don't know, ill feeling, animosity that existed in the band. David, on the other hand, has refrained as much as possible from ever commenting on any of this stuff, which of course is a form of insulation on his part. So there is a sort of imbalance there. It's not like there are other quotes talking where he's talking about what he thought of everybody else as far as that goes.
You described downtown New York City in the 70s as, quote, a much romanticized, little understood place.
Mm.
What did you learn about that time that surprised you?
Um, well, I grew up in New York City. I am a native New Yorker, unlike Talking Heads, who I describe as settlers in the book, taking the word from E.B. White and his wonderful book about New York. But so that scene on one level was very familiar to me. I lived through it. Actually, I was living in Boston during most of the second half of the 1970s, but I was in New York all the time. I went to CBGB's, I went to Max's, I went to all of those clubs, and it was a familiar place to me in that way. Um, when I say it's been romanticized, I really mean two things. One is that specifically the rock scene, the scene around CBGB's, was itself romanticized by a group of New York City music writers. One of the things I talk about in the group in the book is that in New York in the 1970s, particularly the mid 1970s, became the center of music writing in America. Largely because in 1975, I think it was, Rolling Stone magazine, no, maybe it was 77, Rolling Stone magazine moved from San Francisco to New York City. And Rolling Stone at that time was the great organ of music writing in America, although there were a lot of other ones too. Um, Other writers like Lester Bangs, who was one of the premier rock critics of that period, moved to New York in that time. Everybody sort of coalesced in New York. Um, the Times had what they called their first chief rock critic. 10 years before, the idea that the Times would have had a position of rock critic was an absurdity, right? But John Rockwell was the chief rock critic of the New York Times, and of course Robert Christgau ran the music sort of operation at the Village Voice, which was a very robust critical operation, and so on and so forth. These writers, when they saw what was happening at CBGB's, made a direct connection between what was happening there and what had happened at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, what had happened at the Marquee Club in London, in slightly after the Cavern Club, to these amazing regional music scenes that had developed, that had produced the Beatles, the Stones, the Who, this sort of in the 1960s, not to mention cities like Memphis or Chicago, the south side of Chicago, that were in many ways the real centers of rock and roll in the 1950s. So they wrote about this with an intensity and a kind of romanticization that the difference was it was immediately projected into the mass media of the entire country. And as a result, some bands, probably the Ramones are the best example, which were, extolled by this cadre of New York rock critics, actually wound up hardly selling any records, hardly having any kind of a following outside of the city, except for this sort of a kind of fringe in every city who adopted them as that way, but basically struggled to have a musical career from beginning to end in that sense, even though they're now regarded as icons of early punk in that sense. Um, and so that's part of the romanticization. The other part of the romanticization, of course, is that the city was teetering on the brink of collapse during that period. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently, um, in terms of in terms of what's happening in New York right now, we have an upstart mayoral Democratic mayoral candidate who has made affordability the watchword of his entire campaign. And what that relates to is how difficult it is for working class people, for a great many people, to survive in New York, given the price of cost of living and the price of rent and the price of home ownership and everything like that. And that's a continuing problem for another group of people, not the working class, but for the artistic class, the creative class in New York City now. Much of what happened in New York, this amazing renaissance in downtown New York, which had less to do with CBGBs than it did with the art world and a kind of the avant-garde in the arts in general, theater and film and all of that sort of thing, um, had to do expressly with the issue of affordability. When Chris Franz and Tina Weymouth and David Byrne moved into their loft on Christie Street, their rent was something like $289 a
Mm.
month. Okay, they were all working at menial jobs, which meant that they could more than afford that. Okay, um, just I actually have done the math recently. Adjusting for inflation, that is to say, in 2025 dollars, right? That loft that they moved into on Christie Street would now go for about $1,200 a month. Okay. If you go into the real estate listings, you'll find that it's actually renting for about $6,300 a month. So that's 5 times the amount adjusted for inflation. And that's a measure of the unaffordability of New York City now for people like them, as E.B. White described them as settlers who moved here with a desire to make their way in the arts in the city. And that's an interesting problem that we're confronted with right now in that way. But it's New York in the mid 1970s, because of the frankly municipal collapse, was one of the most affordable cities anywhere in America, and that has a lot to do with what happened here in that time.
He is Jonathan Gould. The book is Burning Down the House, Talking Heads, and the New York Scene That Transformed Rock. It is out now. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Steve. It's been a delight talking to you, and I hope people will feel rewarded by the book.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve Richards.